Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be unpacking the life and philosophy of Martin Buber, a thinker whose ideas are as relevant today as they were a century ago.
Yeah, that's right. And with your background in philosophy, I think you'll find his approach to dialogue, relationships, and what it means to be human particularly fascinating.
Excellent. Now, Buber wasn't just some armchair philosopher, was he?
Not at all, not at all. He was incredibly prolific, author, scholar, translator, activist, and his work spanned, well, everything from Jewish mysticism and biblical studies to social and political philosophy. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Buber as our main guide today.
Perfect. So let's start at the beginning. Buber was born in Vienna in the late 19th century, a time and place that was a real hotbed of intellectual and artistic activity.
Yes, and the encyclopedia highlights the fact that Vienna was a truly cosmopolitan city, a melting pot of cultures and ideas, and this diverse environment definitely played a role in shaping his thinking.
I can see how that would be like fertile ground for someone like Buber.
Absolutely. And here's a detail I found intriguing. Buber was raised by his grandparents in Lemberg, now part of Ukraine. His grandfather was a renowned scholar of rabbinic literature, but considered himself, and I quote, a Pole of the Mosaic persuasion.
Wow, that's fascinating. It speaks to the complex cultural landscape Buber was navigating from a young age, this blend of deep religious tradition with a broader European intellectual worldview.
Precisely. And that complexity is mirrored in his work. The encyclopedia mentions that even in his youth, Buber was publishing essays on Austrian writers like Schnitzler and Hofmannsthal, so he's engaging with both religious and secular literary traditions.
So even his early interest in literature hints at his later philosophical focus on dialogue and the power of language to create meaning.
You picked up on that, yeah. Buber was interested in how we use language not just to convey information, but to truly connect with one another, to bridge the gap between I and thou, as he would later put it.
Okay, so we're starting to see those seeds being planted early on.
Yes, but those seeds wouldn't fully blossom until later. Buber's early work was heavily influenced by his fascination with Gestalt theory.
Now, Gestalt is a tricky concept even for, like, philosophy folks. Can you give us a quick explainer?
Of course, of course. Gestalt emphasizes that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For Buber, Gestalt was a way of understanding how humans find meaning and achieve self-realization through creative acts, especially art.
So it's about seeing the interconnectedness of things, how individual elements come together to form a greater whole.
Yes. And Buber initially applied this idea to aesthetics, seeing art as a powerful way to bring disparate elements into a unified and meaningful experience.
But as the encyclopedia points out, World War I became a turning point for Buber.
A major turning point. The war forced him to confront the limitations of his aesthetically driven worldview. It wasn't enough to just find meaning in art. He had to grapple with the harsh realities of human suffering and conflict.
And that's where his friend Gustav Landauer comes out. Right.
Exactly. Landauer, a prominent anarchist thinker, challenged what he saw as Buber's somewhat romanticized view of the war's impact. He criticized Buber for trying to fit this complex, devastating event into a neat philosophical framework.
So Landauer was essentially saying, you know, this isn't just some grand artistic expression. This is real life with real consequences.
That's a great way to put it. And that critique had a profound impact on Buber. It pushed him away from his focus on aesthetics and toward what would become his most significant contribution to philosophy, the philosophy of dialogue.
So this is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So we left off with Buber, kind of at a crossroads, shifting from aesthetics to a focus on dialogue. And this is where his most famous work, I and Thou, enters the picture.
Precisely. And thou is really the cornerstone of his philosophy, where he lays out this idea that human existence is fundamentally shaped by relationships, by the ways we encounter and engage with the world around us.
Now, I know this is like Buber 101, but for our listener, and for anyone who might not be as familiar with I and Thou, can you break down these core concepts of I, Thou, and I, It?
Sure. Buber argues that we relate to the world and to others in two primary ways. The I-thou relationship is one of genuine encounter, a meeting between two subjects where both individuals are fully present and open to the other.
So it's not just about exchanging information or going through the motions of interaction. It's about a deeper level of engagement,
Yeah.
recognizing the other person's full humanity.
Exactly. In an I-thou relationship, you're not reducing the other person to a role or a function. You're encountering them in their wholeness, their thou-ness, recognizing their unique perspective and inner world.
This makes me think about those moments when you truly feel seen and heard by another person. It's a powerful feeling, and I can see why Buber places so much emphasis on this type of encounter.
It's a fundamental human need, this desire to be truly seen and acknowledged. Now, contrast that with the I-it relationship, where we relate to the other person or thing as an object, something to be used, analyzed, or categorized.
So in the I-it mode, we're not really encountering the other person in their fullness. We're interacting with them based on our own needs or agendas. It's a more transactional or utilitarian way of relating.
Yes, and Burba doesn't say that the I-it mode is like inherently bad. We need it to function in the world. We have to be able to treat objects as objects to, to get things done. But when the I-it mode dominates our interactions, it can lead to a sense of alienation, a disconnect from ourselves and others.
It's like we're reducing people to mere instruments or things rather than recognizing their inherent worth and dignity.
Exactly. And for Berber, this is where things go wrong. A life dominated by I-it relationships leads to a diminished sense of self and a lack of meaning.
So the key takeaway for us here is that Bieber is calling for a shift in our way of being in the world, a move towards more I-thou encounters, recognizing the thou in every person we meet.
And this idea has implications that extend far beyond interpersonal relationships. Buber applies this philosophy of dialogue to our relationship with nature, with art, even with the divine.
It's about approaching everything with that same sense of openness and presence, that willingness to truly encounter the other in its fullness.
Exactly. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also highlights Buber's work in other areas. He was a prominent voice in the Zionist movement, advocating for a Jewish cultural renaissance in Palestine.
Given the complexity of that issue, especially in the early 20th century, I imagine that was a challenging path to navigate.
It was. Buber's vision of Zionism was unique. He wasn't just focused on establishing a Jewish state for political reasons. He envisioned a place where Jewish culture and spirituality could flourish, a true cultural and spiritual homeland.
So it wasn't just about creating a physical space. It was about revitalizing a culture, a way of life.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that his approach to Zionism reflected his broader commitment to dialogue. He believed that a Jewish homeland should be built on principles of peace and cooperation with its Arab neighbors.
Again, we see that emphasis on dialogue as the foundation for building a more just and harmonious society. It's not about domination or exclusion. It's about finding ways to coexist and thrive together.
Yes, and this commitment to dialogue also informed his political theology.
Now, for folks who might not be familiar with that term, what exactly does political theology entail?
Political theology explores the relationship between religious beliefs and political ideas, how those two realms intersect and influence each other.
Okay, got it. And how did Buber approach this intersection?
Well, he was deeply critical of both fascism and communism, which were dominant ideologies during his lifetime. He saw them as systems that failed to recognize the fundamental importance of the individual, the I, and the thou.
So for Buber, these ideologies were ultimately dehumanizing because they sought to impose a monolithic worldview on people, stifling dialogue and genuine human connection.
That's a good way to put it. He saw these systems as reducing individuals to mere cogs in a machine, erasing their unique identities and undermining the possibility of authentic relationships.
Given the historical context with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, Buber's critique feels especially relevant. He was witnessing firsthand the dangers of these ideologies and their impact on human dignity and freedom.
Absolutely. And in response, he offered an alternative vision, a more decentralized and utopian society inspired by the biblical Book of Judges.
Now, that's a connection I wouldn't have expected. How does the Book of Judges inform his political theology?
Well, Buber saw in the Book of Judges a model for a society without a centralized state apparatus, a society where communities govern themselves through dialogue and consensus.
So he was drawing on ancient religious texts to imagine a more just and equitable political order for the modern world. It's fascinating how he weaves together these different strands of thought, his philosophy of dialogue, his engagement with religious tradition, his political ideals. It's all interconnected.
That's what makes Buber such a compelling figure. His ideas are deeply rooted in his own experiences and wrestling with the complexities of human existence, and they continue to resonate with us today.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface of Buber's thought. There's so much more to explore.
There is. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve into Buber's later work on philosophical anthropology, where he grapples with the concepts of distance and relation, and will examine the criticisms and lasting impact of his ideas. So stay tuned for that.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Martin Buber. It's amazing how his ideas on dialogue and the I-thou relationship have, like, rippled out, influencing so many different fields.
Yeah, his impact has been profound. And in this final part, I think you'll be especially interested in Buber's later work on philosophical anthropology.
Okay, the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions a key theme in his later writing: the tension between distance and relation. Can you unpack that a bit?
Absolutely. For Buber, distance and relation aren't opposites. They're actually two sides of the same coin. He argues that you can only truly connect with another person, or even with the world itself, if you first acknowledge a certain distance.
So it's not about erasing boundaries or trying to, like, completely merge with the other. It's more about recognizing that inherent separateness, that space between us, which allows for genuine encounter.
That's a great way to put it. Distance, in Buber's view, isn't a barrier to connection. It's actually a precondition for it. It allows you to see the other in their fullness, to recognize their otherness without trying to subsume them into your own experience.
This makes me think about how we often talk about losing ourselves in, like, love or friendship. But Buber seems to be saying that true connection requires us to maintain a sense of self, to recognize the other as separate and distinct.
Yes. And this idea has profound implications for how we understand relationships, how we approach ethical dilemmas, even how we engage with art and religion.
Okay. The encyclopedia also mentions Buber's focus on the role of images
Yeah.
in mediating human connection. What exactly did he mean by that?
Well, he was referring to those things that help us bridge the distance between ourselves and the other, whether it's a painting, a religious symbol, a metaphor in a poem, or even a mental construct. These images act as a bridge between our inner world and the external world.
Say it's about how we use symbols and representations to make sense of things that might otherwise seem distant or unknowable. I'm starting to see how this connects back to his early interest in art and aesthetics.
Exactly. Buber saw this image-making capacity as fundamental to human nature. It's how we grapple with the unknown, how we create meaning, how we form relationships.
Now, no deep dive would be complete without acknowledging some of the criticisms that have been leveled at Buber's work. The encyclopedia mentions concerns about philosophical rigor, the accessibility of his language, and even accusations of misrepresenting certain aspects of Jewish mysticism.
Right. Right. Those are valid points. Some critics find his language too poetic, his concepts too difficult to define precisely. Others, particularly scholars of Jewish thought, have argued that Buber presented an overly romanticized or simplified view of Hasidism.
I could see how his emphasis on subjective experience and the power of dialogue might rub some people the wrong way, especially those who favor more analytical or systematic approaches to philosophy.
Sure, but even his critics acknowledge the significance of his contributions. Buber's ideas have sparked countless debates and discussions, pushing us to think more deeply about the nature of relationships, the role of dialogue in human life, and the challenges of bridging the gap between self and other.
And despite the criticisms, there's no denying the lasting impact he's had. The encyclopedia points to his influence in fields like education, psychology, and interfaith dialogue.
Yeah, his emphasis on the I-thou relationship has resonated with people from all walks of life. His ideas have been applied to everything from psychotherapy and conflict resolution to environmental ethics and social justice movements.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the philosophy of Martin Buber, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listener with?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that Buber offers us a way of being in the world that prioritizes genuine encounter, a way of relating that goes beyond the transactional or the utilitarian. He calls us to recognize the thou in every person we meet, to engage in dialogue with openness and humility, and to cultivate a sense of wonder and presence in our interactions with the world around us.
That's a powerful message, and one that feels especially relevant today in a world that often feels fragmented and disconnected.
It is. Buber's work reminds us that meaningful connection is still possible. If we're willing to put in the effort. It's about being present, listening deeply, and approaching each encounter with a sense of curiosity and respect.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the thought of Martin Buber. We hope this has been an insightful journey for you.
And if Buber's ideas have sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore his writings further. There's a whole world of thought waiting to be discovered.